Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you once again to this interesting discussion. As you see, the discussion is on the higher order goals in school education, philosophy, policy, and pedagogy. Now, we have with us a very distinguished panel. We have Dr. Narayan Lakshman, we have Aruna Ratnam, and we have Ashwin Prabhu. We were supposed to be joined by Mr. Sudan. Unfortunately, he's been taken ill. So we will have to manage without him. Just a short introduction. Dr. Narayan Lakshman is an associate editor at The Hindu, one of India's largest English speaking daily newspapers. As a member of the senior editorial management of the newspaper, Dr. Lakshman manages its opinion pages, writes editorial and opinion articles, and has curated special editorial projects including article series on India's water and healthcare crisis and investigative features. He has written over 2,000 articles to date. He regularly appears on news television channels as an expert political commentator. From February 2010, Dr. Lakshman served for 6 years as the Hindu's US correspondent based in Washington, D.C., sending dispatches on a wide range of subjects, from strategic issues in Indo-US politics to healthcare reform and the immigration controversies. Prior to this role, Dr. Lakshman worked in the Tamil Nadu Bureau of the Hindu's Chennai headquarters, where he wrote about rural poverty and development. His doctoral research at the Development Studies Institute at London School of Economics on political economy of poverty elevation in India was synthesized into a book titled Patterns of the Poor, Caste, Politics and Policy Making in India, which was published by the Oxford University Press in March 2011. He has also served as a consultant at the Asian Development Bank, where he authored a working paper on the political economy of good governance for poverty elevation policies. He has been a research analyst at a London-based hedge fund. Dr. Lakshman has a BA in economics from St. Stephen's at Delhi University, MA in economics from Cambridge University, and an MSc and PhD in development studies from the London School of Economics, London. He is a Kamal Nayan Bajaj Fellow at the Ananta Aspen Center, New Delhi, and a member of the Aspen Golden Leadership Network. Aruna Ratnam has worked as a teacher in Rishi Valley School, Andhra Pradesh, and Alcott Memorial School in Chennai. Her work with the Tamil Nadu Science Forum included serving as a state coordinator of Makkal Palli Iyakkam, an after-school program in 1,000 villages. She served as education specialist for Tamil Nadu and Kerala with UNICEF for 14 years. Her PhD in Cultural Foundations of Curriculum from Syracuse University, New York, examines the intersections of educational provisions by the state and parental aspirations through fieldwork in Shivagasi and South Chennai. She has translated many articles and a book by Kancha Ilaya from English to Tamil and published a few original articles on school education in Tamil. She is now a director in the Madhuram Narayanan Center for Exceptional Children. Ashwin Prabhu says he found his way into teaching in a rather fortuitous manner. After degrees in engineering and management, right on the threshold of a conventional corporate career, he came upon Krishnamurthy's book on education. The book caused him to pause and reflect for the first time on his own schooling and the role it had played in his life choices as a young adult. For the next 10 years, even as he journeyed on in his professional life, he kept coming back again and again to fundamental questions around education and its purpose. Eventually, at the age of 33, he joined the school, the Krishnamurthy School in Chennai, to teach English and history. His only qualifications for the role being an abiding childhood love for these subjects and a ready willingness to work with children. The years he spent in school allowed him to examine his questions around learning, growing, and finding one's place in the world in a more deliberate and experiential manner. And the book Classroom with a View, Notes from the Krishnamurthy Schools, is an outcome of that engagement. The book is available outside for those of you who are interested. He divides his time now between working with teachers and schools on educational philosophy and daily practices, and the Azim Premji Philanthropy as a consultant. Welcome all three of you, and I'm sure we are going to have a very interesting discussion ahead. And we hope to learn a lot from your deliberations. Over to you.
Thank you, firstly, for all of you being here, and Mr. Chandramouli for that introduction. So the topic, as you must have seen, is higher order goals in school education, philosophy, policy, and pedagogy. Of course, this conversation came in the immediate instance out of this book, which probably some of you at least have in your hand, and as he said, it's outside, by Ashwin. But I think I am also I'm an alumnus of the school KFI Chennai, and this is a conversation that goes back a long, long way. It is a conversation held that is, people who are looking at what more does education mean beyond numeracy and literacy. It is certainly an important and ongoing conversation with them, but it is also a conversation within the schooling system more broadly. And wherever you're looking at more meaningful ways to expand the circle that children find themselves in a school setting, the themes we're going to be talking about today will matter to that. So I would just ask that you keep in mind the broader picture as well, both for the Q&A, which we'll come to at the end, but also while you think about the concepts we talk about today. So I wasn't sure if I was going to do the introduction, so I'll skip over that part. Thank you, Mr. Chandramouli. So I think Ashwin, writing about his book, he says that the need of the hour is to elevate education to a general interest topic, to open it up to more non-politicized public discourse, and to hold it accountable to higher order goals than literacy and numeracy. Without preempting the discussion today, I would like to say that we should focus on linking this aspect of school education to the kind of society that we want to live in, that we find ourselves in today, so we can look at the past and see how we are where we are today and the role of education in that, but also looking to the future to see how further to work, I don't want to use the word reform, but to work with educators, with school systems, with the government, with parents and children themselves, of course, as the primary stakeholders, to arrive at the kind of society that we think makes sense for our reality. So Ashwin's words, of course, which he elaborates in a variety of different ways and through experiences that students and teachers have had, who have gone through the system, have been inspired by J. Krishnamurti himself, who spoke of these values and this system and these attributes throughout his life. For example, when he said, education is not merely acquiring knowledge, gathering and correlating facts, it is to see the significance of life as a whole. The function of education is to create human beings who are integrated and therefore intelligent. So there's a lot to unpack here, not least the question of what it means to be integrated, or for a child to find that sense of integration, but also the sense of what mechanisms, what features, what pedagogies will help to actually make that happen, to move from where we are in different systems, which are more commonly focused on curricular learning, to that sense of intelligence which appreciates life as a whole. So you're talking about skills and just a way of being that just goes beyond textbook learning. So there's much to unpack in that. So to start things off, and before we get into detail, let me just say that, reflect on my own experience. So I was in the school from kindergarten, lower kindergarten until the 10th grade. And I was quite happy that also for the last two grades of my school, 11th and 12th, I was in a non-KFI school, which helped me get a sense of both systems. I was just telling Ashwin this, so it's good that I have a comparative basis to speak on. And to me, one of the main attributes of my first many years of schooling in KFI that jump out is learning in a fear-free ecosystem. So obviously, as a child, you have many potential sources where fears or anxieties can creep in. It can be a fear of competition. It can be a fear of failure. It can be a fear of letting down someone else or yourself or your parents. So I'm not saying that that was entirely eliminated, but the way the learning ecosystem was designed by very purposeful design in the school, there was a deliberate attempt every day, every minute that you're engaging with children to dissipate that fear. Even if there was a natural proclivity for it to come up in the mind of a child whose ability to process learning inputs is evolving, there were mechanisms in place to dissipate that fear or to engage with that fear and work with it and help the child understand how the child could move beyond that. So just to bring it from a less abstract description to more practical and physical almost attributes, it would involve things like nature walks, silent time, or culture class, what you'd call, where you do not necessarily speak about a textbook subject, but you engage with your teacher, your fellow students, and you are speaking of things that matter to you deeply. Similarly, the nature walks, the quiet time, it helps you appreciate the value of silence. That's not something that you find regularly featuring in any syllabus. And over time, I think that the child and children as a community start to appreciate the value of that. So I think I speak for several of my cohort, some of whom are in Chennai, many of whom are all over the world, when I say that these attributes continue to influence us today because they give us a sense of, when you were in school, you grew up feeling a sense of rootedness as your own roots were spreading. And as I said earlier, your emotional intelligence was growing. You grew up experiencing that growth in a non-threatening, non-fear environment. And that stays with you through life. So I think we can get into other such attributes, but there are many of them to unpack and the psychology of them. So let me start off by just saying that we look at, as the title says, the philosophy, the pedagogy, and policy aspects in turn. And I would invite Ashwin at this point to jump in to start looking at what philosophical aspects or values even within the J. Krishnamurti system of learning contribute to building that link between what's happening in schools and the broader society we live in.
Thank you, Narayan, for that very personal take on what your experience was as a student in one of these schools. Before I respond to your question, I also just want to say thank you to Chennai International Center for having us here and giving us this forum to talk about education. And I think Narayanan hinted at that right at the very beginning, saying we need to have more of these discussions, right? So education needs to come into the general discourse, as it were. So thank you for that. It's also a rather intimate setting. We did hope that we would have more people, but it's good to have a few of you here. I see some familiar faces, students, parents. So there are many people who've kind of partook in this experience. So it would be interesting to hear from them as well during the Q&A. But to come back to what you asked, Narayan, how schools and society are interlinked, and are they at all? So here's my position really right at the outset. My belief is that schools and society inform each other in equal measure. And this is a two-way relationship. And coming to think of it, schools occupy this rather unique and peculiar position where they are simultaneously a conception of society, but are also best placed to reconceive society itself, right? So they're both a product of society, but also something which feeds back and can actually, form and shape what society is. So if we were to ask the question, what kind of school do we want for our children today? I think how we answer that question is bound to determine the answer to the coupled question, which is what kind of society will we be tomorrow, right? So I think answering the first question in the present is going to kind of, in a deterministic sense, reveal what our tomorrow is going to be like. And there are a few ways of looking at this really, right? This two-way relationship which I speak of. And one way of doing it is like this, to ask ourselves what are the most urgent and pressing questions which face society today, both at a local and perhaps national level, but also at a global scale, right? And I think given the timing of the question, maybe the issue which pops up topmost in all of our minds is the pandemic, right? And that's the recency effect kind of manifesting itself. And I think when we talk of the pandemic, we recall this rather Herculean effort of the scientific community to come up with this vaccine in record time. So this has no doubt been possible only by this really vast, mature body of scientific know-how which exists in the world. But the fact is, pandemics are at least hopefully once in a century kind of phenomenon. So what are some other issues which plague society on a daily basis, right? One may say something like, let's say, climate change, for example, right, which is very much in the here and now. My sense is that one can argue that something like climate change is perhaps a fallout of what is rather a pernicious culture of this production and consumption cycle, which in itself is a product of modern manufacturing technology. So I would venture that the jury is still out on whether a solution for something like that is going to come out of the technological realm, or perhaps does the solution lie elsewhere. So where am I really going with this, right? So I'm really asking, what is it which we experience on a daily basis, which is very immediate as something which society is grappling with today? So when I look around and read the morning headlines, for example, right, the things I see on a recurring basis are an inability of individuals and institutions with different worldviews to come together and work, setting aside ideological differences. So I see that. I also see some kind of a general inclination in humanity to amass power and authority for oneself, which in turn contributes to, I think, a very glaring kind of inequality which has been written and spoken of enough. What I also notice is a rather pervasive climate of discord, which is both political and social in nature, right? And which manifests itself in very many ways. It can manifest itself as, let's say, geopolitical aggression, which we are seeing today. It can also manifest itself, this climate of discord can also manifest itself in something which is very local, the kind of violence we see and we read about. But also this sheer inability of people of different worldviews, different ideologies, abilities, to come together and work and relate to on a daily basis. So if this is the case, right, I think it may be interesting to also see what are schools doing, right, in this larger social picture which I've kind of painted. What I see is schools have taken on a form where today they are institutions which are largely encouraging and building a culture of individual excellence, individual achievement, and individual success, right? So in many ways, school is seen and accepted as a place to hone one's own individual ability. So how do we reconcile the two, right? On one side, there's this glaring question of a very real difficulty in both institutions and individuals coming together and working despite their differences. And on the other, we see this continued and renewed focus on kind of building this individual capacity, which schools and higher education, of course, work a lot on. So really the question I'm then asking is, if schools are not interested in these questions, right, how are children going to grow up and live and work together with each other when clearly there are differences in abilities, likes and dislikes, belief systems, gender, age group, right? Generational divide, so to speak, all of this, right? So how are they going to kind of cross this chasm, so to speak? So that's on one side. On another, also, how can they grow out of a certain rigid identity, which I think most young people tend to develop, which invariably revolves around, let's say, language or religion, or in an urban setting like ours, let's say socioeconomic class, for example. So how do you grow out of these rigid identities and set them aside and still be able to relate to and work together on a daily basis? So really the question I'm asking then is, if schools, which are, in my opinion, very well positioned to kind of catalyze some of these conversations with young people if they are not interested in doing it? So what kind of a society can we wish to have tomorrow? So that's really the starting point for this thought experiment, really.
So, Aruna, let me ask you. I think Ashwin interestingly pointed out that not only is society the product of our schooling system, but schools are, in a preliminary sense, also the product of society. And as we know, in every country, but certainly in India, there are all those divisions that Ashwin also mentioned, whether you're talking about caste or class or language or religion. So if we are to start a conversation about the values that could help, start unpacking those, the sort of the clash of cultures in a sense that we talked about, is it, what does it take to bring the broader ecosystem in tandem with schools and start addressing that big question of individuality, of self-focus, and a lack of a broader vision? How do you bridge that gap?
Before I answer your question,
Sure.
Before I answer Mr. Narayan's question, I have a minor reservation about this hierarchy of goals. Okay? And in that sense, I think those of you who know J. Krishnamurti will agree with me. Literacy and numeracy are not lower goals than, social cohesion or social transformation that we expect schools to do, right? So anyway, keep that caveat in mind. So I don't necessarily agree that literacy and numeracy are lower order goals, okay? They may be lower hanging fruits in your garden, but for a large number of children who are outside the garden, who have been fenced off, these low-hanging fruits are very important, right? Okay, so with that, I'm a little bit of a, let's say pinko-Marxist, okay? Not red Marxist, but pinko-Marxist. So I would say society and school that relationship is dialectical, right? Because there is a power dynamics there. When you say they reinforce each other and those kind of words. And I also want you to question that in any society, can education be divorced from relationships of power that exist in that society? So if you divorce the relationships of power, your schools will not make sense. Who goes to what kind of, and we are talking about schools as though they are monolith, right? They are not clones of each other. Even KFI schools are not clones of each other, right? The Shivali is very different from CFL, which is very different from KFI. And KFI, the school, was very different when it was in Besant Nagar and what it is now. They are reconstructing, reinventing themselves, I would say, because the location was very, very important for many of the KFI schools. I think all of you will agree, those who have gone to KFI schools. So let's actually think about this question of power, because the relationships of power in the society is what determines what shape many of these schools take, right? So yes, almost every KFI school is an elitist school, right? So yeah, I know those of you who studied there are smiling, but that's the label you must have heard again and again and again when you step out of your school bus or step out of your school campus, right? But then, Indian society is a highly unequal society. The inequalities are very, very, very stark, right? So I have a mother in my center who is wondering how she is going to procure a new medicine that her doctor has prescribed for her child, which costs 400 rupees, right? And and when I come out, one of my friends say, "Oh, let's go have coffee." And where we go have coffee, each, espresso or whatever, we pay a bill of 600 for 2 hours for 2 cups of coffee. Now, this is the world. So, as a result, uh, I am a little bit of an amphibian as well, my personal experience wise. I grew up in a village where there was no bus. To this day, I can't ride a cycle. I can ride a bullock cart. I can drive a bullock cart, but I can't ride a cycle. Right? And yet, I taught in Rishi Valley. My second teaching job was in Rishi Valley, which is actually, as far away you can get from my Panchayat Union primary school in Kadattur as possible, right? So my trajectory, both in terms of personal growth and in terms of uh, professional achievement, individual achievement, is really like this, right? And that was the case in in my generation for many of us. Or many of us studied in government schools in Tamil medium. I remember when I went for my pre-university, I cried because everybody was talking in English. And at the end of the day, I was like, oh, fuck, I can't stay here. And one of my seniors, we were in a dorm, and one of my seniors, third year student, she came and she said, look, what are you crying about? So I said, English, I don't understand English. So she said, English is another language. The kudumiya pudichiruma, வேற ஒன்றும் இல்லை. So, in that sense, our schools are very, very different, right? Even today, even in Chennai. When KFI was located in Damodar Gardens in Besant Nagar, I was teaching in Alcott School. And there, it was the Theosophical Society's two ends, basically, and very symbolic of the kind of children who actually live in this society in South Chennai in those days. Alcott School was 1/3 of Alcott School population at that time was from fishing villages. There was still fishing in Besant Nagar in those days. It's not like that now. 1/3 were what Alcott would have called Panchamas. And the rest of them were a mixture of lower middle class, lower class. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because the values that Krishnamurti schools taught me, I learned to be an adult in some ways. I learned to be with children, how to be with children when I became a teacher in Rishi Valley, right? So those values can be replicated. It's not a question of it can't be replicated. Those values are important for children, particularly if you're interested in child development. Not education of children, not schooling of children, but in development of children as individuals, as citizens, and so on. But having said that, what is the culture of a school? It's a tessellation of huge number of small details, right? You need adults who can actually see how this mosaic of culture can be built in that area, in that location. That's why I say the location is very important. Alcott School, for instance, did not have the money power of KFI. And yet, Alcott School had teachers who actually got their children to talk about their lives. So one of the projects that Purnima, who is now in Marudam, Purnima and I did with the children in Alcott School was to shadow their mothers. Boys will shadow their mothers, who were mostly maids in our kind of houses. And for nearly 1 month, they did that. And we use that in social studies, we use that in math for various averages, how to calculate averages, what is the amount of, how much amount of water it takes for your mother to wash your pants, how much water in the house that she works is flushed every time they flush the toilet. So there was a huge amount of, KFI was doing similar things. So in terms of how we actually did work, did not, and KFI was ICSC, we were state board, they were English medium, we were Tamil medium. But then I will also tell you, because of my background, I'm a little bit of a bully, right? So I guilt-tripped every single resource person who would come to KFI to offer same training or same service in Alcott school for 2 hours. So Kuthupadrai, the school will pay Kuthupadrai guys to do drama and all that with you. And I would bully them into coming and spending time with Alcott school children. And so they would do a different kind of theatre workshop in Alcott school. We did with Dakshin Chetra. We did this with Indian Express and Dinamani. Mr. Samandam was in Besant Nagar. He was a resident of Besant Nagar. So actually, Kolapan was the one who was the education correspondent at that time. So between them, they actually started giving us, this was much before, I'm talking 97 to 2001. Silver Money, Mr. Samandam will come on Saturday night, straight from the press with Silver Money, which will come on Sunday with the paper and give it to Alcott school and go. So there were a whole lot of things that we were able to do. But having said that, right, this is because what mattered was how you were with children, as teachers, as adults. It did not matter whether these were Tamil-speaking kids, whether they were, their fathers were half the time drunk, their fathers beat them up. So it is very, very possible that, the kind of values that you're talking about as individuals, if you think about children as the center of what we do as adults, it's very possible we can do that. And lastly, just to get to one specific, right? You talked about culture class, right? Now, the interesting thing about culture class is that in government schools now, and even before, throughout, I also want to clarify before I go into this. When I was UNICEF program officer, education program officer, let me be very clear. UNICEF's job at that time, my job description, was to support the public system for children. So whether it was child protection or whether it was education, whether it was child survival or child participation, UNICEF's job was to support the governments of Kerala and Tamil Nadu to put in place all the mechanisms for implementation of Child Rights Charter. Right? So I worked very closely with the government systems, and I visited a lot of schools and teachers. I still am in touch with huge number of teachers from government schools. So yes, when teachers learn how to be with children, that is the crux of the matter of a school culture. They know how to build infrastructure. But having said all that, let me also say this. But constantly going against the majoritarian view of what a school should do is very stressful for teachers. No amount of salary. Government school teachers are paid very well, right? Whereas my salary when I joined Shivali was 500 rupees a month. At that time, a government school teacher equivalent with my education would have been drawing 15,000. Right? This is 1980, 84. So even today, the government school teachers are paid very well. Public school teachers are paid very well. But no amount of money can actually buy them the energy and the time they need to be with children that they are responsible for. So I'll stop here and we'll.
So yeah, thanks for those starting comments. I think we've opened up quite a few issues. Let me just, before we move on to the next section, put out a question for either both of you, which is we're looking at values almost like it's a static, or the influence is coming from society into schools, and schools are simply dealing with, coping with whatever comes their way. And when I say comes their way, I mean in terms of specifics, like the geography, the culture of students who are coming in, the culture of teachers, the culture of parents. But the school is hardly a passive environment that's simply accepting and working with. It also, like we said in the beginning, influences. It's almost like I would like to call it a pushback, but there is an influence and a dialectic force there which matters. And so, do schools do that? For example, KFI schools do that in any small way, whether Olcott or the school?
Whether they respond to,
or how do they respond? I mean, I'm sure there is, of course, some kind of response. What is the response when you see certain kinds of cultural sort of features of your school as it is?
see, I would think that schools are very much living organisms, right? So they are growing and evolving and constantly reflecting on the work they do, the practice they do. So in that sense, I think it's very much an ongoing kind of process. But to also answer your question in terms of does the texture of the conversation change, or does the texture of the discourse change? I think ever so often there are issues which present themselves, right, which call for a certain examination. The form and shape it may take may change, but it's important to kind of recognize the change in form and shape and talk about it. For example, technology, right? I mean, trying to answer your question straight off. I think at least in some of the KFI schools, there's a lot of talking around technology and what it means to this project of education, right? And I think Aruna hinted upon the fact that there is something else which one can call almost sacred in the space between children and teachers. And I think that bond, that relationship needs to exist, right? So one wonders whether technology is actually a substitute to that at all, right? So quick answer to your question is yes, I think there are ongoing conversations all the time. I think schools call for a re-examination of these issues, or at least schools should call for a re-examination of these issues and not accept something as a given. I would think that's very much part of the enterprise of education. So that's a short answer to your question, but if you want to talk a little more about other things, we can pick them up as well.
Sure. So Aruna, to your comment on the elitism aspect, does this response from schools in any way shift categories, or is an elitist, some would call an elitist school, forever doomed to be an elitist school? That's what I meant by the two-way influence.
See, like most issues in schooling children, this elitist label also is a double-edged sword, right? Because you're elitist, you can afford certain kind of locality, certain kind of gentleness that the teachers of other schools may not have the luxury of, right? And your parents, for instance, are better informed parents about what the school wants to do with the children. Krishnamurti used to constantly ask, I am giving, and because Shivali was a residential school, all of us felt extra responsibility because children were with us day and night for 3-4 months a year, every term. So he would say, I have brought my child here. What are you doing to him? And that would be a shock every year, when he came. And so the rest of the year, you actually were sort of, that question was at the back of your mind as you were dealing with, oh, there is no hot water, Akka, this, she actually took my book, Akka, this thing is missing, Akka. While you're dealing with all this question was also at the back of your mind, right? So yes, schools are living organisms, but there is a pressure now on all schools to actually fix themselves and say, this is what we do. Right? We prepare you for NEET, we prepare you for JEE. If you come to our school, you don't need to go to coaching classes. Actually, given the direction of the national education policy, schools are going to become irrelevant. Because if all I need to do is, join a coaching center in the evening, right? And in the morning, whatever I want to do, why should I go to school? Because for my higher education, all that matters is the entrance exam, whether it is NEET, whether it is CUET, or whether it's JEE, or I write these exams, and if I don't do very well, there are private colleges where my parents can buy me a seat, right? So why should I go to school? So schools are also now, as institutions in this political economy, they are under pressure to reinvent themselves. How they do it, why they will go in a particular direction, will they become tuition classes, will the coaching centers like Baiju find a contract with many of the schools, so will the teaching be contracted to Baiju, etc., etc. I'm sorry, Baiju is the first name that came to me. There are similar organizations across, right? But I want to answer one question. I want to take this away from this air-conditioned room. Schools' response to the children's problem. When I was doing field work for one of the for European Commission, actually, end of DPEP and before Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan began, we wanted to see how a particular village has fared. It was a case study of a village and what a district primary education program has been able to accomplish in that village. This was in Kadalur district, and there are two schools, and many of you I think are familiar with the village economy or locations of design of houses and so on. Uru colony, right? Colonykum urukum oru. I hope all of you understand that much Tamil, right? So colony is basically where the Dalit households were, and Uru is where the non-Dalits, upper caste. Actually, that village didn't have Brahmins, completely non-Brahmins. Landed, they lived. And the elementary school was in the Uru. And in this 800 meters that children had to walk was fraught with danger, even though it was along a bus route. So these were times when there were a lot of caste-based clashes between Vanyars and Dalits in that area. So there was one teacher in the main school who was a Christian Dalit. So he would collect all the Dalit children and he would walk with them in the evening. And same thing he used to do in the morning. So this is how they had to respond. And the interesting thing was, the other teachers were as concerned about these children, but then they were all non-Dalit Hindus. And they were afraid of what the Ur Makkal will say if they walk these children there. Therefore, the Christian Dalit was seen as a neutral party. And he would actually, they had to do something. Otherwise, children will definitely, because there were occasions when their school bags were taken away from them, books were set on fire, etc., etc. So this is the reality of majority of schools, and schools do respond. I know a number of schools in many of these kind of places where one of the jobs of the teacher is to group the children, as in my village time. Those of us who had to cross the river and those of us who had to go in bus. So we would group ourselves in rainy season and we would go together as a group. We never went individually during those times. So a lot of these schools have to do this kind of thing. So this is a question actually. And Ashwin talked about discord, right? Groups are not coming together, people are not coming together. We are very divided society now, right? So one of the tectonic fissures in this society is not just economic inequality, but also identity-based politics has led to reconfiguration of caste identity. You were talking about rigid identity of children, but unfortunately, rootedness and rigidity of that identity, it's a very thin line that separates it. You call it rootedness, right? You're sure of where you came from, what your values are, but caste has stepped in to do that for many, many young people now. Now, how are we going to address this? Without that identity, I have nothing. This identity gives me a certain connectedness where I live. If I drop out of school, if I don't have a job, I am very sure within my Uravin Murai, somebody will give me a job, somebody will support me. So, how are we going to address this? Are the schools ready for it? In a way, the elitist schools are immune from these kind of things. But individuals who come to the school and who go out of the school are not. You do have to deal with it because the fallout of this kind of discord is going to affect you as well, just like climate change.
Okay, thank you both. So Ashwin, do you want to tell us a little bit about the wider relevance and implementation possibilities at the national and state level, where for these philosophical and pedagogical practices that set aside the KFI schools and systems, that it could be spread further, and you can talk about specific pedagogical practices. What I said about learning in a fear-free environment, to something more, linked to the way society is, which is, somehow working towards healing the divides, the caste divides, the class divides. Is that something that can firstly be truly imbibed in these schools and then secondly spread beyond the KFI school system, as it were?
Sure, Narayan. So we could go into that. But also, I would like to sound out a caution, right? I mean, a lot of what we're speaking of, and I think Aruna is speaking from personal experience, also kind of paints this very real and true picture of this being a tale of two schooling systems, really, right? So we're talking about the so-called elitist school on one side, and we're talking about harsh realities of a large majority of schools in the country on the other hand. But what we're also really very interested in, and I think the question which is important to ask, which Aruna asked in her own way, is regardless of which school you attend, which school you work in, right? What are some things which, as concerned adults, we should be interested in working with children, right? And this should be free of privilege or lack of it, right? Or access to a certain kind of school or the lack of access to that kind of school, right? So regardless of all of these, what is it that we are really interested in working with children on? So I would 100% concur with what Aruna said. I think foundational literacy and numeracy is a very, very important and vital objective of what schools should set out to do. But I think equally important is this concomitant question, which is, should that be the only objective, right? And I think somewhere there is a gray area there which people are not very clear about, right? So there are lots of resources which are being spent on foundational literacy and numeracy, and somewhere people have begun to believe that that's the only thing which schools need to do. And yet on one side we have some of the very harsh realities which she speaks of, right? So really I think the spirit of this question is saying, what else should schools be doing? If they're very much a part of society, then can we just be quickly satisfied with trying to do our best in foundational literacy and numeracy? So that's one. The second thing about what are some ideas which are worth taking at scale, right? Which are relevant regardless of your local geographical, physical context or your socio-economic, socio-cultural kind of context. In fact, I was hoping that Sudan would be here because as a practitioner and as a policy maker, he could have thrown some light on that. So I think there's very, Aruna is also part of the State Education Policy Committee, so she's, I'm sure, working on some of these changes as well. So she should tell us more. But I was quite heartened to see a few weeks back this government order which was passed by the Samagra Shiksha Department that art and craft will now be given 2 periods every week across government schools in the state, right? And for me, that was a huge step, right? And of course, I think it was also qualified saying what kind of art and craft are we talking of, right? So this is not some homogeneous classical definition of what art and craft is. But I think the premise is that this art and craft, which students and teachers will explore together, will be local to the geography where the school belongs. And there will be variations and there will be all of the localizations which come out of, recognizing the fact that there is something here which is valuable and important to understand about who you are and where you come from. So this idea has now been, I think, in public consciousness for a long time, that it's not just enough to study math and science and all of that, right? So somewhere art is important. And there's this dreaded word of it being an extracurricular kind of thing. So what should be curricular, what should be co-curricular, and what should be extracurricular, I think is a matter of investigation by itself. But I think broadly, I think at least urban society has come around the fact that we need to do more than just math and numbers and science and all of it. And art has now kind of gained a certain standing and is seen as of some value in the educational process. So, and one can understand it at many levels, right? So it's not about giving respite to the child from the drudgery of math and science, but art in its own right has a way of doing something to the learning mind, which is just not possible through certain other subjects, right? But where I'm going really is, I think once there's this public acceptance or once there's this comprehension of something which is essential to a learning ecosystem, how do you then make that insight available to a larger mass of schools? So I think referring again back to that government order, I think it requires a certain conviction from policymakers. And I think that conviction comes out of listening to various quarters, right? And dialoguing with various quarters. And once the conviction comes in, I think the power to kind of roll it out at scale is something which only the government has. And the government also occupies this very peculiar position in the economy today, right? Especially in education. It is a regulator. It is a provider also, right? And in one sense, it also sets policy. So it's policy maker, regulator, and provider of education, right? And some of these are at crosshairs sometimes. So I think it's important for policy making, right? To see the need for some of these changes, which can be done at scale and should be done at scale. And I think change starts from that. What are some other ideas which we could possibly go into which might hold relevance? I can think of many things. I can see that we're running out of time, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking of. But I'm also very interested in this question of how sport is played in school, right? And I think not enough thinking has been done around that. And I think one very quick way response which I have got when I talk about this is, but sport is the stellar example of how schools stress on teamwork. Right? So who says school is only a place for individual achievement? So what about organized team sport, right? So doesn't that teach you teamwork? Doesn't that teach you camaraderie? But my sense is I would like to nudge people to look a little beyond that. So yes, there is teamwork, but in a very, very specific temporal kind of context, right? Which exists for the duration of the game. And one sees cooperation and working together in sport but it's all in the service of a very immediate objective, which is invariably against a certain opposition to achieve a certain desired result, right? Which is a common goal which all of you share. But what after that, right? So does that spirit of camaraderie, or does that understanding of what it means to work together extend beyond the duration of the game? So I would like people to take a relook at how sport is played in school, and I think invariably schools again are our best chance for children to understand that there are many ways of playing sport. For example, mixed age, mixed gender, mixed ability sport, I think should be a very organic and natural thing which children do, right? And I see people hurrying, adults especially, very quickly hurrying children to organized sport, right? Which has a certain set of rules, which has a certain written down set of ways in which things should be done, and there's always a scoreboard, right? So invariably it kind of takes you down a certain different path. But it would be wonderful, for example, I think there is a certain recognition which has already come in the public school system that it's important to have games in the first place, right? And I, as part of the philanthropy work which I was doing, I was in Mailadurai a few weeks back and visiting a government school. And we were looking at the possibilities of some kind of netball program for girl students in Mailadurai. So the headmistress there told me something very interesting. She said, "Sir, we have only one physical education teacher who has been allocated to this school, and he's a male, right? So he's a man. So what happens is he takes the boys and he plays with the boys, right? And these are senior school students. But the girls don't have a teacher of their own, right? And this teacher, this particular physical education teacher, either doesn't have the bandwidth or is not equipped to work with girls as well. So invariably what the girls do is they just spend time sitting in the classroom, right? Maybe just thumbing through their books or whatever. And then what happens is the subject teachers come in, look at the girls and say, anyway, you girls are not playing, so why don't we do a little bit more of subject time? So the girls are sitting in the classroom going through their academic books, but the boys are out playing. And the reason I say this is because of this, very firm kind of set pattern that boys play separately and girls play separately, right? And there are many responses which come when I propose an idea like this. So there's also this cultural angle saying, but culturally it's not done here. But I'm not quite sure that's true, right? When children are young and when they're in the community, they're playing together. So essentially a relook at sport, right, at scale would be something which I think would be very interesting and very essential. And maybe one last idea, I think if I can take a jibe at this entire practice of writing and essay writing, right, which is again, I think something which is done quite a bit in schools, this idea of sitting down and writing an essay. And this is not something which let's say, is only in the government school system. For example, in the ICSE board, I remember, right, the class 10 or maybe was it the class 12 board examination had this question, right? Capital punishment is necessary for the country, right, either in support or in opposition of this. Okay, so that was one question. And another year, there was some other question. There was a question about the ends absolutely justify the means, right? Right, in support for or against. So this is this kind of oft followed kind of question pattern, right? Which is you sit down, take a contentious issue, and at the outset, it is polarizing in its nature, right? And you have only one choice. You either speak for it or you speak against it. And in a span of maybe 15 to 20 minutes, you're expected to write either defending or, opposing a certain stance. So I'm not sure what is educational about this, right? And what are children actually learning? So if what we want them to do is a certain kind of critical inquiry and a certain kind of critical thinking, surely there are more effective and creative ways in getting children to engage in critical thinking. For example, and this is something which I'm sure you will like, this act of student journalism. So if you want to go into a question and inquire into a question, instead of trying to answer it individually as a purely literary exercise, could this be a process of collaboration where you're going back, talking to a variety of people, right? Getting in different opinions, looking at all of these inputs, and then kind of arriving at your own understanding of the issue, right? So you look at an issue 360 degrees, right? So that kind of an exercise perhaps for students would be far more valuable. So there are several such, I think, simple pedagogical ideas which are not resource dependent, right? So whatever I've spoken of now is not only for elitist schools or is not for a certain kind of school, but I think it calls for a certain conviction in the power of the idea itself and its relevance to young people across the country. So these are some things which perhaps I think policy definitely should be looking into.
Aruna, do you think the schools you were talking about, arts and crafts and sports, can make a difference or matter at all? Or?
Like you said, I wish Sudan were here. In the past 1 year, actually, Tamil Nadu government at least has, particularly under Sudan's leadership, Sarvasiksha Abhiyan has brought back many of those extracurricular activities into schools. So they actually also have film showings every month. So they send the films. Last month was Children of Heaven, was screened in all the schools, government schools. And there was a discussion. Many of the children actually saw it and talked about it and so on. There is also the foundational literacy project under Sarvasiksha Abhiyan, in which Ramanujam and I were the external advisors to design materials. In that, what we have done is, this is for class 1 to 3. So the material is, see, all of us agree that the textbooks are not written for children. The textbooks are written to satisfy vested interests, to satisfy political aspirations of adults. The textbooks that are written and given to children, they are not written for children. Therefore, we had to actually devise workbooks. And in those workbooks, all the activities that we usually assign to art class, sports class and all that has been combined into the regular textbook. So the workbook actually involves a child actually taking 5 steps, then going back 3 steps and counting. How many steps did you take? So there is a lot of movement. I'm talking about 1 to 3. Okay. 10th standard, 9th standard is all exam going. So we are practically approaching South Korean levels when it comes to public exams. Okay, we are too self-important adults. Therefore, we are not stopping air traffic and traffic in this thing like the South Koreans do for the exams. But exams are very important in high school. So what Ashwin was saying about the mixed sports and all that is not going to happen. The reason I keep talking about caste is one of the reasons many government schools don't want girls and boys to interact together beyond the classroom is Kadal vandrom odi poiduvaanga. So think about how caste affects lives of young people and schools. But this thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of what we can take from elite schools to government schools. Okay, many of the government schools, at least in Tamil Nadu, are by circumstance multi-age group. So class 1 to class 5, there are 20 children, 40 children, 100 children with 2 teachers. So it's ideal for mixed age group, mixed ability kind of strategies, etc. But what happens is, unless you have that attitude that this is an advantage, right? That having older children and younger children together is an advantage, that it gives me extra hands, extra human resource. If I don't have that attitude, I will see this as a burden. So this is a constant thing that I've been encountering with teacher unions. Teacher unions insist there should be a language teacher, English teacher, science teacher, math teacher in class 1 to 5. Whereas, that for the child, he is learning about the world and wants to articulate. He is not interested whether this is science. இந்த மலைக்கு என்ன பேர், இந்த பாறைக்கு என்ன பேருன்னு ஊரை சுற்றி இருக்கிறது தெரியாம, why are you teaching them geography and all that at that stage? So MAG is a strategy that very easily that can work provided the teachers and the adults around. Actually, parents protest. Government school parents say, நாங்கள் வந்து பக்கத்தில் இருக்கிற private ஸ்கூலுக்கு we will send our children because there is a separate class and a single teacher per classroom. So there is actually enormous amount of miseducation about how children need to grow up. And if the so-called elitist schools can actually carry that message to an average parent and say, look, your child needs to develop. School is one place. Your city, your neighborhood is another place. So if there is a neighborhood development, smart cities are being developed, insist that there is a children's park. So these kind of messages that if the elitist schools can actually carry to society at large, I think that will make a huge, huge impact. And that will be a better way of contributing to the larger argument, larger debate on where we are going with our education and how we are going to make a future society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're running a little short on time, so let's open it up for Q&A. We've covered a lot of ground, so please just raise your hands, introduce yourselves, and ask your question.
There was a mention about child rights some time back. My question is regarding second, third, and I don't know, maybe a fourth language sometime in the future. Is the poor child ever thought of in all this planning? Or is it like how the books are designed by older people for the younger children? Who is there to speak for the child? Is anybody speaking for the child? That's one question. The other thing is to the journalist. We keep reading about elephants being run down and trains are slowed down, highways are closed, everything. That's thanks to the newspapers constantly carrying these articles. Somewhere I read that some 27 elephants had died in the last 10 years, but 3,000 human beings had died due to elephant attacks in the past 5 years. Nobody knows this. So I do believe that even the child rights, the newspapers should take it upon themselves to highlight these things. The poor children cannot speak for themselves. So if somebody can answer about second, third, fourth language, that bothers me. Today, translations are free on social media. Why do we need a second language or anything of that? Let the child choose, let the parent choose.
Understand. So, I mean, let me take the question that, addressed to journalists first, which is to say that we, at least at the Hindu, we certainly have education as a priority. I wouldn't say we speak from the point of view of the child, but we have engaged with educators and policymakers over such a long time and over such a diversity of issues in terms of designing curricula, other aspects of the school ecosystem, that we have a view on what is good for the child, and it is often at odds with that what you said about just spewing out a textbook to fulfill a political need. So we are often in opposition to that. So in a sense, we are a proxy for the voice of the child, but maybe you're right. I value that suggestion. We should probably have children come to the Hindu office and tell us, in terms of these issues, what do they want? That is actually quite an original approach. So, but again, as I said, we have our own voice in this. Would be my core point, and it doesn't align with standard textbook writing and institutional practice. Aruna, you want to jump in there?
Well, there is this whole idea of duty bearers. There's this whole idea of duty bearers when it comes to child rights, right? The older children do speak. There are child parliaments. For instance, the committee that I'm on, we just had one meeting with children in Kannagi Nagar who have been forcibly removed from their original habitations in the city. So there will be those kind of consultations, and there are child parliaments that are run by NGOs. North Chennai, for example, has ward members from students in that area. And when I say students in that area, it means all children from private schools as well as elementary schools, from government schools. So there is child engagement as the children become more articulate. But for the younger children, in terms of provision of how every child will have the facility, enabling environment has to be created for every child to enjoy that right. So that the duty bearers, parents, NGOs, civil societies, media, as well as government. That is why the public system is very important. It's very easy to close a government hospital because it's functioning badly. But it is extremely difficult to reopen it. It is easier to, let's not actually completely do away with these whole ideas of, language and so on, because language is part of our identity. So first language, second language, whatever legal name it is. But it is very important for children to name the world, to own the world that they live in. Language is very important. And it needs to be the language that they speak at home, emotionally they identify, and not English necessarily.
Ashwin?
No, I just want to add one limited point to what Aruna said, and in response to the question on language, I think there's this general lack of understanding on the distinction between the language and in its role as being a medium of instruction and language as a subject in itself. Right? I think it's important to look at that carefully, because the language of instruction is one, and which I think has to be what Aruna is saying, right? Which is what the child is naturally growing up in his or her home environment with and is most comfortable learning in and parsing the world through. But there is also this opportunity to learn language as a subject, right? And that, I think, in the modern context we live in, there is some consensus around English being that language, right? Now, rather than look at it in terms of a pecking order of first language, second language, third language, I think this distinction is important to make. Language as a medium of instruction and language as a subject. And I think if we understand that well, then I think it's quite commonsensical to go about doing this. Of course, the whole issue is quite politicized, and that's why the question of a third language comes up, right? Which is in addition to these two functional ways of looking at language, which I speak of. But that's all I would like to say about that.
Okay, we don't have much time, so maybe two more questions. Yeah.
Good evening to everybody. My name is Suresh Malya. My question is in 2 points. Part A is in agreement with what Ms. Aruna Ratnam said. I too studied in Tamil medium in a government-aided trust temple school in Thiruvargadu from class 6 to class 12. I was reasonably good in both English and Tamil, and a school topper thing. There, class 6 to 12, so you have 7 standards into 2 sections is 14. And there was only one physical male education, physical instructor. So while the boys we were playing, the girls were just sitting and watching. So there is a little mindset, and there needs to be a change. There should be one physical education instructor for both male and female, depending upon the ratio of number of students and how many instructors. That is one. Second part of the question is one of the elite members that we have, Lieutenant General A. Arun. And since you are from print media, you can collect this, gather the question and write a little article. The present situation of the entry or to the army, the defense level is a brilliant, fantastic idea. But 4 years after studying, and then they have to do a graduation, that was one point that was missing. Would it have been better if they've taken the students after +2 with the physical requirements, what is required, and then conduct a 4 years graduation course in Army, Navy, Air Force, So then they at least have a good
can we
graduation.
avoid questions to the audience? We'll stay on
No,
topic.
because we have an expert.
No, I appreciate that, but
Okay,
we have
can
this
take
fixed
it off
seminar.
the stage, I guess.
I think
offline.
you could speak to him
Okay,
offline. I
fair
think that's
enough.
better. We can take your first. Was there a question you made a comment?
No, but you can no. Your
About the
question
physical
is,
education.
Okay, in the education you can also what is the main point they missed out is if they have kept the same curriculum like after +2, a 4 years graduation in Army, Navy, Air Force.
No, I'm talking about the first point you made about physical education in
Yes.
your school. Was
Yes.
there a question there?
Yeah, but is there any changes that is it being done, and what is your take on this?
Okay, that's fine.
What is the present
Okay,
scenario?
Aruna, you want to take that very quickly because you brought up the example.
Yes.
Okay. Why don't you take 2-3 questions and then... Sure. Okay, we'll bunch them. Sir?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I had a question for Akka and Ashwanana as well, if you'd like to answer. So Akka was trying to say, I think toward the end of her speech, that if elitist schools, they talk to other schools and they talk about what they have learned and things like that, how it could help other schools also change in a certain way. So I think when Akka also, she started off talking about how education and power are interlinked. And I also wanted to add that money also in some way at this point of stage has another third aspect to power and everything as well. So I studied in a KFI school, so I'm also from KFI, the school. So after studying there and finishing, like even after graduating and everything, I can see two differences between what Ashwanana and Akka are talking about. So
sorry, just can we keep it really quick and ask the question? Because
so
we're running out of time.
So Anna was trying to talk about whatever the school and how KFI worked, and Akka was talking about how Alcott school and everything, and she also talked about how identity and everything is important, right? So I was just wondering how can you bridge the gap between these two schools? Like I know Ashwanana gave an example of sports as well, but where a school like KFI that talks about what identity as a concept means, who are you and who is I, that itself as a concept, whereas a school from where Akka talk comes from, like you need to, there's some people who are still fighting for their identity in some sense.
Sure.
Right?
Okay.
So
I think we've got that question. We'll just take a few more if you don't mind.
It's not
Yes.
working.
Yeah, so even I'm from the school KFI, and one of the questions I had was, so a lot of what we learn is from textbooks, and it's always directed in a certain way towards what you want to do in a higher education sense. And like you said, the extracurriculars is not given as much importance, but is slowly gaining a lot of importance. So something that I've realized through my schooling is it allows for a certain sense of creativity. And as Ashwanana said, how to creatively do like critical thinking, or how using creativity you can build your own identity, and how a school can, in some sense, push the child to think in a creative manner rather than give them textbooks and things to just learn in that sense. So my question really is, should schools give that inclination towards the child to allow them to pursue that level of creativity, or kind of shun it down?
So I think we have 3 broad questions. Okay, one last one and then we'll wrap up.
Field, how many schools have playground? Ashwini was talking about sports. I just want to know how many schools have playgrounds. That's the first question. And Aruna, as you are in the field, I just want to know, I am born in 53. So there was a period for hygiene and one for moral science. All these these periods are there now in classes?
Okay. You want to
Because
start
I don't
with that?
know. I don't have any idea because I was born. Huh?
Okay.
There was a period for class for hygiene. And that was a very important class. They will take off with nail skirt, haircut, everything. And there was a class for moral science. I was born
Okay.
in 1953. So that was a different era altogether. But I just want to know how many schools have playground?
Yeah, we've got it. Okay. So Aruna, you want?
And-
We'll finish these and come back. Otherwise, we won't have any answers for any question.
Can I just add?
Yeah,
on
just
to
please
this?
hold. Yeah, we'll come back. We'll just do rapid fire answers.
Physical education.
Yeah.
I had a problem that we need. This is this is analogous to medical sciences, right? You need a specialist for left ear and a specialist for right ear, right? So this physical education business, physical educator, most schools, private schools I'm talking about, where there is a physical educator, he is used as a disciplinarian. Assemblyல லைனா நிற்கிறதுக்கு கையில் தடியை கொடுத்து he is. So I would much rather not have a physical educator like that than, and most of the teachers can actually manage a lot of sports, maybe not organized sports, right? Having worked in Rishi Valley and in Alcott, there's a ground and the children will choose what they want to play. We didn't have a physical educator, we couldn't afford it. But the children actually, they played whatever, Coco, Vanda Coco, idu adu ellam. And the thing is that they actually also, like I said, the older children actually regulated younger children, and it became, it happened much more organically because we didn't have a physical educator. So physical education teacher illa, adnala they actually did that.
Okay, second question on reaching out across KFI Alcott schools from him.
Can
Ashwin,
I
you
just
take
add
that.
on?
Sorry? No, just let us finish this. We'll come back in the last few minutes.
No, I think what I gathered from what those two young people were talking about is a couple of things. One is the space for conversation, right? And I don't think that's resource dependent. I think that's dependent on an interest which the teacher has in the growing up of the child, right? And the second thing which they spoke of was an encouragement to think independently for oneself, right? So this ability to think independently and not necessarily quickly accept what is a received idea, but to question it, wrestle with it, interrogate it, and then finally make your own meaning out of it, right? So the entire continuum of arriving at an independent point of view. I think that's important and that's valuable regardless of what kind of a school you study in or go to. So I think if people broadly see value in both of these things, then I think pedagogically it's absolutely vital to bring it into the classroom and into your educational practice. So hopefully we don't have a policy maker here today, but I'm hoping that policy makers will take heed of it sooner or later.
And the last question from her on moral science and playgrounds.
Okay. We don't listen to children at all, right? Young people at all in schools. So I would much rather that moral science class be like culture class or circle time. I know, but at this point, it worked in our time maybe, but right now it is better to have something like circle time so that the students can articulate, because following the pandemic, a lot of children have a lot of anxiety across board, okay? Whether it is elitist school or whether it is a very poor school, young people are having a lot of anxiety. And it's better to let them articulate rather than tell them more, ரெண்டாவது மாரல் சயின்ஸ் தமிழ்நாட்டில் சொன்னீங்கன்னா உடனே நாலடியாரும் திருக்குறளும் தான் வந்துடும். And I would much rather not talk about Manai Machi to a sixth standard child. Okay. The hygiene question, it's a huge issue. There is we tried this menstrual hygiene handbook. We tried this menstrual hygiene handbook called Take It Easy Policy and all that. But the problem is there is a lot of resistance from teachers in government schools. They are very, they don't want to talk about this to their students. So the health department actually did 5 videos, one separately for young men, young lads, and one for girls. And the thing was that the one that was meant for the girls had both what happens to an adolescent body, to a male body as well as female body, and how to take care of what is secondary sexual characteristics and all that. But then in the government system, they never actually look at what process worked better. There is no feedback at all, right? So as a result, once that particular government, that particular IAS officer left the health department, the whole thing got dropped. But it is a very important issue for a huge number of girls. Recently, I met with a whole lot of tribal children who are dropped out of school, who have been brought back. Actually, Sudan and I met them together. And one of the things that we were discussing was all these girls were saying, neither in their habitation nor in the school they were going, there is no safe way of disposing of sanitary pads. Sanitary pads are given in the school, free of cost to the girls. But then there is absolutely no hygienic way of disposing of them. So, வீட்லயும் காட்டில் போடுவோம் madam. And during the period time, the girls don't come to school because the school toilets don't have water. Now, this is a persistent problem, and this hygiene business is a huge, huge issue for a huge number of young people, both at home and in the school.
Very quickly, we can just squeeze in two more questions. I think one was here, one there.
Yeah, we have been talking about elite schools and non-elite schools, but I've always had this thought that do the elite schools actually equip children to face life? And when compared to the non-elite school children, those who come out from the so-called non-elite schools, I feel are more equipped then to face different problems in life than the elite schools. One thing. Second, we were brought up in a way where we didn't have counselors, we didn't have psychologists, or we didn't have student counselors where we could go and talk to. But then we somehow have turned out into better human beings, I think. Even in fact, the children now have many means to talk to parents. As a parent, as a teacher, children now come and tell us, hi teacher. They don't tell good morning teacher. That is how they wish us. So that is how we have been approaching children. In spite of that, why do children now go into depression? And why do we have so many suicidal cases? Why do we have so many student problems when we never had it? But we never had so many of these, I think, than the children now have.
I'll just say one thing there, which is that to your second question, obviously now there's social media, there's far more connectivity, and kids very easily can get ideas, and the information flow is much greater in that sense. But in terms of the actual level of depression cases, suicides, I think maybe there's also been a change in an improvement in the reporting. So we looked at this with regard to many different demographics, even let's say farmer suicides, all kinds of things. One has to be extremely careful about the reporting side as well before jumping to the conclusion that there's a increase in suicides. I take your broader point that I feel there's a more open up of space where students can articulate freely. There are two sides to that also. I think, for example, I have school age kids, and I appreciate their relationship with their teachers in terms of having that freedom. So I grew up, KFI was an exception. It was elitist, and I could get away with a lot. But like in other schools, there was I found that sense of that space, that gap between me and the teacher, intimidating. So there are two sides of it, and I think especially in this post-pandemic context, a lot of children value having that, there may be things going on in their home where they're not able to articulate. That could be fueling anxiety too. So to be able to speak to teachers in a little more free manner, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing always. But Aruna, Ashwin, you want to respond?
I don't know about the first question. That's a tough one to respond to because there's a generalization there in the statement you make, right? That students coming out of elite schools are quite ill-equipped to take on life, whereas students coming out of the so-called non-elitist schools are better prepared. When you start with a generalization, I think it becomes difficult to actually go into understanding the issue better. I think it would be more instructive to see what does it take to meet society as it is, in its as-is state, and what does it take to live, find work, find one's own place in this world. And I think when we look at those attributes, perhaps that will present a better and clearer understanding of what should we really be working with children on. and which schools are working on these issues, which schools are perhaps not working on these issues. So that may be a more constructive way of looking at of that issue.
Okay. Any final question?
Good evening. I'm Ravi, architect. I don't want to talk about policy, but Ashwin spoke about sports. Aruna said about location, and you spoke about nature walk. See, today most schools have no character to it. It's anybody starts a school if they have a house and 5 rooms or 6 rooms. If you see older schools like MCC, Church Park, Good Shepherd, Don Bosco, there's a lot of open space around. That is what is really lacking in our school. Like how Aruna said, in Don Bosco, there was no PT teacher. During lunch break, everybody used to go and play. There was a lot of open space around. So I think that is very, very important, which is totally lacking in a, like in Don Bosco during lunch hour, we used to go to the museum nearby, and that was nature walk for us. So I think policies are important, but before they design a school, they should say that a school should have this many acres. Without that, they should not give permission for schools to come on.
Any comments?
இல்ல, அதெல்லாம் இருக்குது. In all the boards, the affiliation conditions include these things. But incidentally, just short this thing. One of the Madras High Court judges actually asked this question. என்னத்துப்பா, sorry. ப்ரீ ஸ்கூலுக்கு எதுக்குப்பா கிரவுண்டு? சின்ன பசங்களுக்குலாம் கிரவுண்ட் வேணும்னு சொல்லாதீங்க. So that is the attitude.
Correct. But tell me, you know, how many schools are following that?
Actually, most schools do. The older schools have space. But let's also be realistic. The real estate prices are huge. The one school that does not have ground at all is Mrs. Rajnikant's school.
Many schools, ma'am.
Yeah.
Actually, if you see what happens is the moment you enter a school, there's chaos right from the gate.
Yeah.
So where is the discipline for children?
No, but then, this is why I said we should have, our neighborhood should have spaces for children to play. Whether the schools have or not, the neighborhoods definitely should have.
But schools should not be given permission building if they don't have enough space. I think that is something which...
I think that is something that Mr. Sudhan probably would be able to answer.
I just want to sound a word of caution, right? So essentially, sir, what you're speaking of is this focus on physical spaces. And I think part of the problem which has maligned India's education system has been this decades-long focus on what development economists call inputs, right? So we want to see physical inputs which go into the making of a school. So there are grounds, there are labs, there are smart classrooms, there are computer labs, there are toilets, there are compound walls, all of that, right? And there has been this tremendous push to make sure that schools have the inputs which they need, right? And then today we find ourselves in a situation where the learning outcomes are just not matching up to the inputs. So the fact of the matter is you can have a first-class playground, but if you don't have a concerned adult out there who's willing to engage with children in the playground, then really there's nothing which is going to come out of that. So physical spaces don't make children grow, right? I think we need the people who animate that
necessary
space,
but not sufficient.
which are teachers, right? So there's also this danger of looking only at inputs and not looking at them carefully enough.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll wrap up. Thank you for your questions. You can speak to them offline as well. But thanks for your time.
So it's my pleasant duty to thank the panelists for engaging discussion. I think we started with the classroom with a view, but everyone has a view about a classroom here. So each one's view about a classroom is different. And let's agree to disagree as we move on to the next discussion. The next discussion would be on the 1st of November, 1st of October. We have a very interesting topic coming up. This would be on the introduction of the wild cheetahs in India. So we hope that all of you will be there. And following that, we have another interesting topic, which is North versus South. So this is going to be something which many of you would like to participate in also. So welcome to our future programs, and let me thank our panelists once again. I think we had the cat among the pigeons, where we had views from elitist to non-elitist to the general public. I think the debate can go on, and maybe we'll have further occasions to discuss this important topic of what pedagogy should be followed in schools, whether it is just the rote learning that we have to talk about, the numeracy and the literacy, or whether we have to go beyond these to really build character and build the personality of the child who is put in the school. So thank you very much for provoking these thoughts, and I think many of our, though the audience is small, it is a quality audience, and I think we'll carry back some of the thoughts that that you people discussed and form our own, ways of propagating them. Thank you very much. Thank you.